29 years and 362 days. That's how long I'd worked for Grantwell Manufacturing when I was called into the director's office late on a Friday afternoon. Not even a full 30 years. Not quite. Just 3 days short of my pension vesting in full. David Langston didn't look up from his polished desk as he slid a folder toward me. "Due to budget constraints, today will be your last day," he said with casual detachment, like he was commenting on the weather. I could see his reflection in the glass-framed company awards behind him. He looked calm, controlled. I, however, was doing everything I could to keep my hands from shaking. I'm Melody Reynolds, 61 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I was the senior compliance officer at one of the largest manufacturing firms in St. Paul, Minnesota. For nearly 3 decades, I upheld the law, reviewed every regulation, flagged every discrepancy. I gave this company my time, my energy, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing things were done the right way, even when it wasn't convenient. David tapped the folder again. "Your severance package. Sign by tomorrow. Otherwise, it's void." His eyes never met mine. He didn't have to say what he was really thinking. "We don't need you anymore." But I knew better. The company had just reported record profits. This wasn't about money. This was about timing. This was about cutting me loose before they had to pay out the pension I'd earned. "I see," I said quietly, standing up with the folder in hand. No tears, no protest, just quiet clarity. That seemed to surprise him. Janet from HR walked me out as I packed a few personal belongings: a photo of my late husband Thomas, a potted plant from my daughter, and a plaque commemorating 25 years of service. Not much else. What mattered couldn't fit in a cardboard box. "I'm sorry, Melody," Janet whispered, her voice cracking. "It's okay," I replied, but my voice was distant, cold, almost. As I stepped out into the drizzle of a gray April evening, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just someone quietly keeping the books straight. I was a woman who had just been wronged, and I had the receipts to prove it. How many times in your life have you been loyal, only to be dismissed when it mattered most? And if the justice you waited for never came, would you have the strength to demand it yourself? The tea sat untouched in my favorite cobalt mug as I stared at the envelope on my dining table. The same one David Langston had shoved across his desk with such smug efficiency. The same one HR had told me would smooth the transition. But the only thing smooth about it was how perfectly it timed my removal, just 72 hours before my pension was due. I hadn't opened it until now. Inside was a single-page agreement, 3 months' salary in exchange for my silence. No pension, no continuation of benefits, no acknowledgement of my 30 years of service, just a signature line and a deadline, 5 p.m. tomorrow. I'd read enough corporate policy over the decades to know exactly what they were doing. It was a legal trap, cloaked in legalese. They wanted to close the book on me fast, quietly, before Monday came and the pension clock ticked over. But what they didn't know, what David didn't know, was that I hadn't spent all those years just reading files. I'd been keeping my own. In the back of my hallway closet, behind the linens and holiday ornaments, was a gray fireproof box. Inside were 4 years' worth of carefully labeled binders, USB drives, and printed emails. Every flagged invoice, every discrepancy I'd reported, every ignored warning. I hadn't started collecting them out of paranoia. I started because, 4 years ago, I noticed a string of inconsistencies in loan documentation. It didn't feel right, and when I raised the issue, I was told it wasn't my concern. That was the moment I began making copies. For myself. Quietly. Methodically. Back then, our CFO was a man named Gregory Hale, sharp as a tack and cautious to a fault. When he left to join the Securities and Exchange Commission, I remember thinking the company had lost its last true watchdog. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I still had his number saved. I called him that night. "Melody Quinn?" he said after a long pause. "Wow, It's been a while. Too long, I replied. Gregory, I need your advice on something sensitive. I spoke with him for nearly 2 hours, pacing the length of my living room floor as I laid it all out. The termination, the documents, the pressure to sign. When I finished, there was silence on the line. Then his voice returned, steady and serious. This is bigger than wrongful termination, Melody. From what you've just described, it sounds like securities fraud. You need to get this in front of the right people, and fast. Monday morning, I can get you in with our enforcement division. My pulse quickened. Not from fear, but from clarity. Don't sign anything, he added, and secure everything you've collected somewhere beyond your home. This may escalate fast. By midnight, I'd made 3 identical sets of the documents, one for the SEC, one for my attorney, and one to keep as insurance. I stored them in separate locations. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Something I'd mastered over 3 decades of being the last line of defense between the truth and what the company wanted the truth to look like. On Saturday, the phone rang endlessly. Janet from HR, the general counsel, even David. They left message after message, each one more urgent than the last. But I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because by then, I already knew Monday wasn't going to be their reckoning. It was going to be mine. Monday morning arrived with a gray sky and a quiet I hadn't felt in years. Not the kind that calms you, but the kind that comes right before a storm. I dressed with intention. Navy blazer, pressed slacks, the pearl earrings my husband Michael gave me on our 20th anniversary. He always said I looked strongest when I wore blue. I packed the documentation, over 1,000 pages, into a leather briefcase and locked it shut like it contained a sacred truth. In some ways, it did. The federal building in downtown Milwaukee stood tall and glassy, the kind of place that seemed to absorb secrets and reflect back only silence. Gregory Hale met me in the lobby, dressed sharply, but with the same serious, slightly kind eyes I remembered. Melody, he said, shaking my hand. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. I appreciate you making it happen, I replied. This isn't about me. It's about what's right. He led me into a conference room where 2 others waited, Angela Lopez, a senior enforcement attorney, and Marcus Bell, a forensic accountant with the kind of watchful eyes that missed nothing. They greeted me politely, but with the professionalism of people who had seen too many stories like mine, people discarded when they stood in the way of corporate greed. Angela spoke first. Mrs. Quinn, before we begin, I want to make something clear. Once you share what you've brought today, this becomes an official investigation. There's no walking it back. Are you ready? I nodded. I've been ready longer than I realized. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through everything. The falsified shipment invoices, the backdated quality reports, the inflated revenue statements. I showed them the paper trail, how complaints I filed had been quietly rerouted to Langston's office after he joined 6 months ago, how my concerns vanished into silence, how the irregularities had become systemic. Marcus flipped through a binder and frowned. These revenue adjustments aren't minor. We're talking a consistent 15 to 18% inflation over at least 2 years. Angela looked up from a printed memo. And you reported each of these concerns through internal channels? Every single one, I replied. Documented, time-stamped, and ignored. Gregory leaned in, his voice low. Do you believe your termination was directly tied to your most recent reports? There's no doubt. I refused to sign off on a cost-cutting measure that violated multiple safety protocols. That was a week before I was called into David's office. Angela exhaled sharply. That seals it. This isn't just a compliance failure. It's retaliation against a protected whistleblower, timed to block her pension, on top of fraud. We'll begin formal proceedings immediately. By the time I stepped outside, the wind had picked up. I clutched my coat tighter, but I wasn't cold. I was burning with something far stronger. Resolve. That afternoon, my phone began to ring again. First, it was Janet from HR, whispering like someone in a church. Melody, something's happening. The board just called an emergency meeting. David's locked in his office. Legal is in full panic. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't need details to know what was coming. 2 hours later, a new voice called, William Davenport, chairman of the board, a man who had never once addressed me by name in meetings. Mrs. Quinn, he began, voice brittle, we're reviewing the circumstances of your departure and would like to invite you back for a discussion tomorrow morning. I'm not available, I said calmly. Any further discussions will include my attorney and possibly federal investigators. The silence that followed was long and telling. That night, I didn't sleep. I watched the clock change from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. It wasn't anxiety keeping me awake. It was the long overdue sense that after all these years of playing by the rules, someone else was finally going to have to explain why they broke them. By Tuesday morning, headlines had begun to appear. Federal investigation targets Grantwell Corp. Whistleblower exposes major revenue fraud. Suddenly, I was no longer invisible. I was the center of the storm. At 9 a.m., a courier arrived with a thick envelope from Grantwell's legal team. Inside was a letter withdrawing my termination and placing me on paid administrative leave pending internal review. My pension was still intact. It was a gesture, a late one, but a sign that they knew the ground was shifting beneath them. I didn't celebrate, not yet, because I wasn't fighting for reinstatement. I was fighting for the truth to mean something. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like it just might. By Wednesday morning, my name was in headlines I never asked for, not just on internal emails or whispered phone calls, but on local business outlets and national finance sites. Whistleblower at heart of Grantwell scandal. Compliance officer allegedly fired before pension vesting. I hadn't spoken publicly. I didn't need to. The facts were already moving faster than anyone expected. But as the truth surfaced, so did the backlash. That evening, my daughter Rachel called from Boston. Mom, did you see what Langston said on CNBC? I hadn't. I'd been avoiding television, trying to focus on documentation and interviews with the SEC. He said you were disgruntled, that you had a history of friction with leadership and were let go for poor performance. He's trying to discredit you. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. That's exactly what I expected him to do. It was textbook. When truth threatens power, power attacks the truth teller. And when a woman over 60 dares to fight back, they call her bitter. But it still stung. The next morning, Gregory forwarded a copy of the SEC's official press release. It confirmed an open investigation into Grantwell Corporation and named me formally as a cooperating whistleblower. It clarified that documentation had been submitted in accordance with federal protections and that allegations of misconduct predated the employment actions taken against Ms. Quinn. It was brief, clinical, and exactly what I needed. Still, Langston's smear campaign kept gaining traction. News panels speculated. Anonymous sources whispered half-truths. And suddenly, the years I spent quietly upholding ethics were being boiled down into a tabloid narrative. I wasn't angry, I was activated. Because what David Langston didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd held one final card, not stored with the other evidence, not shared with the SEC, not yet. 3 years earlier, while reviewing archived financials for a long-closed merger, I had stumbled across a chain of emails, communications between Grantwell's former CEO and 2 board members. In them, they discussed manipulating quarterly forecasts to smooth optics ahead of a key acquisition. It wasn't relevant to my reports at the time, so I quietly printed the thread and placed it in a sealed envelope. And then, I locked it in a private safe deposit box at my local credit union, just in case. That Saturday, I drove to the branch and asked to access it. The bank manager, Nadine, raised an eyebrow when she saw me. Melody, been seeing your name in the news. Guess it was my turn, I said with a tired smile. In the privacy of a small vault room, I retrieved the envelope. I hadn't opened it in years. The ink was still crisp, the tone in the emails smug and casual, men who thought no one was looking. I scanned and emailed the thread to Gregory with one note. Changes the timeline. Let me know what you need. His response was immediate. On it. This may shift the scope entirely. That shift came quickly. On Monday, just 10 days after my dismissal, Grantwell's board held another emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but the results didn't require my attendance. 3 board members resigned before noon. Langston, now cornered, gave one last interview to a media outlet, still doubling down on his narrative, now more desperate than defensive. But no one was listening anymore. The company issued a revised public statement that afternoon. It confirmed the resignations. It acknowledged failures in internal oversight. And it ended with a phrase I had never expected to see. We recognize and appreciate the service of Melody Quinn. Too late. Late Tuesday afternoon, I met with Patricia Evans, the interim CEO. We sat at my attorney's office across a long table that felt more like a courtroom than a boardroom. Patricia, once silent in meetings, looked visibly older, grayer, wearier. Melody, she began, this isn't a formality. I'm here to make things right. She slid forward a new agreement. Reinstatement. Full pension benefits, retroactive to the day I was fired. An apology letter signed by the remaining board. And, something I hadn't expected, a 5-year compensation package equivalent to what I would have earned if I'd stayed through retirement. She wasn't done. We're establishing a new ethics and compliance division, separate from legal, independent reporting lines. I'd like you to help build it, as a consultant. If you're willing. I didn't answer right away. My attorney glanced at me, but I held up a hand. I wanted to speak for myself. You want to build something better, I said. Then start by understanding why I kept records at home, why I didn't trust your systems. Patricia nodded slowly. You don't need a consultant yet, I continued. You need accountability, then maybe reform. After that, maybe I'll consider helping. She didn't argue, and for the first time, I felt the weight shifting, for real. By nightfall, David Langston had vanished from the headlines, and I, once invisible, had become the living proof of what happens when the quiet ones keep receipts. By Friday morning, the storm wasn't just brewing, it had landed. The headlines that once danced around words like investigation and allegations now screamed fraud confirmed, SEC, probe shakes, Grantwell to its core. Every media outlet had picked it up. Even the Wall Street Journal featured a full column on the timeline of events. Except this time, I wasn't being reduced to a disgruntled employee. I was a former compliance executive whose internal documentation became central to one of the largest corporate accountability cases of the year. That phrase lingered with me all day. Central to the case. For nearly 3 decades, I had been anything but central. I had been reliable, quiet, the one who double-checked the figures and stayed late to make sure the language was exact. I had made peace with the idea that my work would always live in the margins. Now, the margins were center stage. The SEC had set up a satellite team just blocks from Grantwell's headquarters. Gregory kept me informed, though he often sounded more overwhelmed than triumphant. Melody, he said during a Wednesday update, we've uncovered at least 5 years of coordinated misreporting. Langston didn't start it, he just accelerated it. I wasn't surprised. I'd suspected it. There had always been numbers that didn't quite add up. Reports I hadn't been allowed to see. Projections that seemed too smooth to be true. What stunned me now wasn't the scale of the misconduct. It was how many people had known. According to Gregory, at least 3 members of the board had directly signed off on inflated statements. One had even issued internal memos discouraging the documentation of concerns, unless they reached legal thresholds. In other words, ignore it unless it was already a crime. The SEC was preparing subpoenas. Internal emails were now public exhibits. And then came the next wave: investor lawsuits, retirement funds, pensions, and private equity firms who had poured money into Grantwell based on false reporting, now demanding accountability. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, not silent, but still, letting the truth speak louder than I ever could. That weekend, I received a call from Rachel again. Her voice was tight with frustration. "He's still trying to spin it, Mom. Langston just did an interview with a podcast. He's blaming the culture. Said he inherited a mess, and that you're weaponizing documentation." I didn't flinch. "He's cornered," I said calmly, "and cornered people flail." But I did feel something deep and heavy stir in my chest. Not fear, not even anger, sadness. Because no matter what happened to David Langston or the others who signed off on the lies, none of this could give me back the years I spent believing the company valued integrity, or the nights I worked late thinking it made a difference. On Monday morning, I watched from a distance as federal marshals escorted David Langston and two former board members into the federal courthouse. I didn't attend the hearing. I didn't need to. Their plea agreements were already filed: securities fraud, conspiracy, falsification of records. They didn't fight it. There was too much evidence, too many receipts. The coverage was relentless. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk about whistleblowers, ethics, oversight. They used my name in think pieces and conference panels. But I declined every interview. Because this was never about becoming the face of anything. This was about doing what was right, when no one else would. 3 weeks later, Grantwell sent me a formal letter confirming my reinstatement, full pension payout, lifetime health benefits, and a structured settlement in exchange for damages I had endured. It was generous, far more than I'd expected. But I took only what felt fair. The rest? I used to start something better. I established the Michael Quinn Integrity Fellowship, named after my late husband, for young professionals entering the field of corporate ethics and compliance. The first cohort received full tuition scholarships, mentorship, and direct placement with agencies like the SEC. The rest of the money I kept tucked away for Rachel's children. My legacy wouldn't be headlines or courtrooms. It would be what came after. 6 months had passed since I stood outside that towering federal building with a briefcase full of truth. The season had shifted, and so had my life. The scandal that had erupted around Grantwell didn't just cause ripples, it caused a reckoning. The company's valuation plummeted. Key investors pulled out. The once infallible brand had become a cautionary tale in business schools and boardrooms. But while the corporation scrambled to save its name, I quietly rebuilt the one I had nearly lost. I declined the consulting role they'd offered, not because I wasn't capable, but because I had something more important to do. I accepted a short-term contract with the SEC to assist in developing more robust internal reporting protocols, ones that didn't just protect companies, but actually protected people like me. And then I stepped away. I bought a modest lakeside cottage near Eagle Lake in northern Wisconsin, a place where my husband Michael and I had once talked about retiring. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet. The air was clean. The nights were still. Rachel moved her family back to the Midwest shortly after the settlement. "The kids need to grow up closer to you," she said. And I knew it wasn't just about the kids. It was about healing the time we lost while I drowned in paperwork, trying to stay one step ahead of silence. My grandson, Liam, asked me once, "Grandma, did you really put the bad guys in jail?" I smiled gently and said, "No, sweetheart. I just told the truth until someone finally listened." He thought that was even cooler. We spent weekends fishing, baking, and reading mystery novels together. I taught Rachel how to preserve raspberries and prune apple trees. There was no more checking emails at midnight, no more red lines on 86-page audits. My peace was finally uninterrupted. But peace, I've learned, isn't just the absence of noise. It's the presence of knowing you did what was right, even when it cost you. The fellowship I started in Michael's name has already helped 12 women begin their careers in compliance. One of them, a young Black woman named Simone, called me last week in tears after uncovering misconduct at her firm and being taken seriously the first time she reported it. "Thank you," she said. for making it possible for people like me to not be ignored. That, more than any check or public recognition, was my reward. From time to time, I still receive Grantwell's annual shareholder report in the mail. I read it cover to cover. Their new leadership structure includes a rotating compliance committee, mandatory whistleblower training, and quarterly ethics disclosures. Some of the very things I recommended in memos years ago that went unread. I don't send a reply. The past is not a place I visit often, but I do believe in reading the final pages of any chapter you once cared about, and this one had finally reached its conclusion. Sometimes, people ask if I regret staying at Grantwell for so long, if I regret giving them my loyalty, if I regret being the one who stood up when no one else would. But how can I? Integrity isn't something you borrow, it's something you carry, and sometimes it weighs more than anyone can see. I carried it to the end, and when they tried to take it from me, I held on. So no, I don't regret it. Because even though the company tried to bury my voice, it ended up giving me something greater, a chance to show my daughter, my grandchildren, and the next generation of truth-tellers that the quiet woman in the back of the room matters. She sees, she knows, and when the time comes, she speaks. And when she does, the world changes. Melody's journey reminds us that integrity doesn't always roar. It often stands quietly in the background, doing what's right even when no one is watching. In a world where shortcuts are rewarded and silence is bought, choosing to speak up, even late in life, takes extraordinary courage. For older adults who've spent decades building a career, a family, or a quiet life of service, this story is a powerful reminder that your voice still matters. Your experience, your values, and your ability to see the long arc of truth are your greatest assets. It's never too late to stand up for yourself. It's never too late to demand fairness. And it's never too late to show the world that dignity, earned over a lifetime, cannot be erased by a signature or a severance letter. Melody didn't seek revenge. She sought justice. And in doing so, she reclaimed not just her pension, but her power, her peace, and her place in a world that had tried to overlook her. Let her story remind us all. When you've lived a life with integrity, you don't need to shout to be heard. The truth will speak for you,